The key felt wrong in her hand. Not wrong the way a borrowed key feels wrong, slightly too light or too warm from someone else's pocket. Wrong the way a thing feels when it carries the weight of everything that never got said. Mara turned it between her fingers, while the solicitor's assistant watched her from across the mahogany desk, and she thought, he never told me this existed. 7 years. 7 years of standing close enough to smell the pine and cold water scent of him, and he never once mentioned a vault. The assistant cleared his throat. He was young, barely 25, and he had the carefully neutral expression of someone who had been trained not to react to anything that happened in this office. Mara appreciated that. She was fairly certain her own face was doing something she couldn't control. The instructions were very specific, the assistant said. The vault is to be opened by you, and only by you, within 30 days of the Alpha's passing. He paused, and the neutrality slipped just slightly. It's been 29 days, Ms. Caldwell. She knew that. She knew it the way she knew every other number that had been grinding through her since the night 3 weeks and 6 days ago, when someone had knocked on her apartment door at 2 in the morning, and she had opened it to find Councilwoman Dre standing in the hallway with her hands clasped, and her eyes full of the specific, careful sorrow of someone delivering news they had been rehearsing. Mara had known before Dre opened her mouth. She had felt it 4 hours earlier, a clean cold snap somewhere in the center of her chest, like a wire pulled too tight finally giving way. Callum Voss was dead. Not her mate, not her lover, not even, technically, her alpha, because Mara was not Pac. She was the Pac's human legal consultant, a very precise and limited role that she had constructed deliberately, brick by careful brick, over 7 years of working in the gray border territory between shifter governance and human law. She was the woman Callum called at midnight when the Ash Creek Compact needed language that would hold up in a human court. She was the woman who showed up at PAC assemblies in her good blazer and sat at the edge of the room taking notes, absolutely not watching him the way she watched him. She was the woman whose name was written alone on the first page of a sealed vault she had never known existed. The drive out to the Voss estate took 40 minutes from the solicitor's office in town, and Mara drove it the way she had been doing everything for the past 29 days, with a kind of focused mechanical attention that kept her in the present tense of small decisions. Check mirror, signal, turn. The autumn hills rolled past the windows, in colors that seemed aggressively beautiful, all copper and amber, and the particular deep red of turning oaks, and she did not let herself feel how much Callum had loved this time of year. The estate gates stood open when she arrived. They were always open, she realized. In 7 years, she had never seen them closed. The long gravel drive curved through stands of old-growth oak, and the house that appeared at the end of it was large without being ostentatious, built from the same dark stone as the hills around it, settled into the landscape the way things settle when they have been in one place long enough to become part of it. There were 3 vehicles already parked near the front steps. Mara recognized 2 of them. The black SUV belonged to Reese Tanner, Callum's second, who was currently serving as interim PAC lead, while the formal succession process ground through its required steps. The silver sedan was Councilwoman Dre's. The third vehicle, a dark green truck she didn't know, sat slightly apart from the others. She sat in her car for a moment. She had not been back to the estate since the night of the memorial gathering, which she had attended in her professional capacity and left early from, because standing in a room full of grieving PAC members who could smell human emotion had seemed like a particular kind of cruelty to herself. She had cried exactly once, alone in her car in the estate parking area, for approximately 7 minutes, and then she had driven home and begun the process of being professionally useful, because that was the thing she knew how to do. She got out of the car. The gravel was loud under her shoes. Reese met her at the door before she reached the steps, which meant he had either been watching for her or had heard her pull in, and given what he was, it was probably both. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of physical stillness that senior shifters developed over time, that quality of being completely at rest in their bodies that always read to Mara as a kind of controlled power. His face, when he saw her, did something complicated. Mara. He used her first name, which he rarely did. I didn't think you'd come until tomorrow. The instructions said 30 days, she said. Today is the 29th. Something moved in his expression. Not quite guilt. Something adjacent to it. We didn't know he'd given you a key. The vault was discovered during the estate inventory last week. We've been waiting. Has anyone else opened it? No. He said it without hesitation, and she believed him, not because she trusted him unconditionally, but because Rhys Tanner had never, in 7 years of working alongside him, told her a direct lie. He had withheld things, he had been strategically incomplete, but he did not lie to her face, and she respected the distinction. Who else is here? She asked. Dre, and Soren Voss. The name landed in her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. She kept her expression level. I didn't know he was coming. He arrived this morning. 3 days ago, we sent notification to all surviving Voss family members about the estate proceedings. Rhys's voice was very careful now, the way it got when he was navigating something he considered politically volatile. He has a legal right to be present. Soren Voss, Callum's younger brother, who had left the pack 15 years ago, under circumstances that Mara knew only in outline, the way she knew a lot of things about pack history, accurately, but incompletely. He had gone east, to the Harrow Ridge territory. There had been a formal separation that stopped just short of severance. He and Callum had not spoken, as far as she knew, in all the years she had been affiliated with the pack. She looked at the house. The key was still in her hand. I understand, she said, and walked up the steps. The interior of the house smelled the way it always had, old wood and stone, and something that was the accumulated scent of a place where shifters had lived for generations. Not unpleasant, complex and layered. Councilwoman Dre was standing near the fireplace in the main hall, speaking quietly into her phone. She looked up when Mara entered, and nodded once, her expression shifting into the careful warmth she deployed for situations that required both professionalism and sensitivity. The man near the window was not Callum. She knew that. She was not confused, not even for a fraction of a second, and she was quietly proud of herself for that clarity. But the resemblance was enough to make her breath do something involuntary before she controlled it. The same height, the same broad frame, the same dark hair, though Soren wore his longer, pulled back. He turned when she came in, and then the resemblance fractured, because his face was different enough to resolve the moment. Sharper at the jaw, a different set to the mouth, eyes that were the same dark gray as Callum's, but carried in them something wilder, less settled, the look of a man who had spent years in a different kind of life. He looked at her with open assessment, and no attempt to disguise it, which was so different from the elaborate social protocols of Ash Creek that it was almost startling. You're Mara Caldwell, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. You found your name in the vault instructions. The solicitor informed me, yes. I found out this morning. He held her gaze steadily. I didn't know he'd done that. I didn't know a lot of things, apparently. There was something in his voice she couldn't quite read, something between grief and frustration, and something older, underneath both of those. She was aware of Rhys moving into the room behind her, of Dre ending her call and turning her full attention to the gathering, of the specific quality of attention that a room full of shifters directed at something they found significant. Where is the vault? Mara asked. Rhys led them through the house, down a hallway she had been in before, past the study where she and Callum had spent countless evenings working across the big oak table from each other, not touching, professionally contained, and into a wing she had never entered. The door at the end of the corridor was not dramatic. It was a plain wooden door, and behind it was a plain staircase leading down, and at the bottom of the staircase was a room that smelled of old paper and cedar and something metallic. The vault itself was set into the stone wall. It was not a bank vault, nothing theatrical, just a heavy iron door, with a lock so old it predated electronic alternatives. The keyhole was exactly the right size for the key in Mara's hand. She was aware of everyone watching her. She put the key in the lock. It turned more smoothly than she expected. like a thing that had been maintained over a long time by someone who cared about it. The door swung inward. Inside was a shelf of wooden boxes, neatly labeled in Callum's handwriting. A folded piece of paper sat on top of everything, propped against the front edge of the shelf, where it would be the first thing anyone saw. She picked it up. On the outside, her name. Not Ms. Caldwell, not even Mara Caldwell. Just Mara, in his handwriting, in the way she had seen him write things when he was not performing authority, when he was just himself, in the quiet of a room. Her hands were steady. She opened the paper. The first page was a single line. I should have said this while I could. Read everything, then decide. She stood in the vault doorway with the note in her hand, and she could feel the room behind her, holding its collective breath, and she thought, 7 years. 7 years, and this is how you tell me. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket, and turned back to face the room. Soren Voss was watching her with an expression she couldn't name, but it was not unkind. Reese looked like he was waiting for her to shatter, and was prepared to be professionally supportive if she did. Councilwoman Dre had the expression of a woman who was going to need to manage whatever happened next. I'll need some time with the contents, Mara said. Her voice came out even. Privately. Reese started to speak. The instructions specify, she said, before he could. Read them. He had clearly already read them, because he closed his mouth and nodded. The room, when she was finally alone with it, was smaller than it had seemed with 4 people inside it. She turned back to the shelf, and she began to read. The boxes were arranged in order, not chronologically, she realized after a few minutes, but thematically, organized around events and decisions, and, in some cases, around her. She found her name in the 3rd box, a collection of documents that turned out to be, of all things, a legal argument. Meticulously constructed, footnoted, referencing both PAC law and human legal precedent, making the case for something she had not known was even being considered. The formal designation of a non-shifted human as a recognized mate equivalent under Ash Creek Compact law. She sat down on the floor of the vault because her legs made the decision before her mind did. The document was dated 4 years ago. He had been building this argument for 4 years. He had been consulting legal scholars she recognized, reaching out to PACs in other territories who had navigated similar questions, compiling precedent. The arguments were extraordinarily good. They were, she thought, with the distant, clinical part of her mind that never entirely shut off, better than anything she could have written herself, and she was not given to false modesty about her professional capabilities. She kept reading. There were letters, not sealed, not formal, but handwritten letters on plain paper, the kind of letters you write to work something out in your own mind. Undated. She recognized the habit, because she had the same one. Pages of reasoning, written to no one in particular, thinking by writing. His handwriting was familiar to her, in a way she had never let herself examine. She knew the particular shape of his lowercase r, the way his G's dropped below the line. She had read his handwriting on documents for 7 years. These were not documents. The letters did not declare love in the way she had read about, or watched in films. They were more honest than that, and therefore more difficult to read. They were a man working through his own understanding of a situation he found both necessary and impossible. He wrote about the rules he had followed, the rules he had made himself follow, because Mara was not PAC, because she had not been born into this world, because the bond that pulled at him was not a thing he had the right to act on, without her full comprehension of what it meant, because she had not chosen this, had not known it was even possible, and he could not take that choice from her. He wrote about the night 3 years ago, when she had stayed late at the estate, working through a contract dispute that had consumed both of them for a week, and at the end of it, she had fallen asleep on the study couch, and he had sat across the room and watched her sleep for 20 minutes before making himself leave, because staying felt like crossing a line she had never been given the chance to draw. Mara remembered that night. She remembered waking up with a folded blanket over her that she had attributed to his housekeeper. She put the letter down. She picked up the next one. He wrote about the problem of telling her. Not whether to tell her, she understood, reading it, that he had resolved that question, and the vault was evidence of his resolution. But how? How do you tell a woman who has spent 7 years building a careful professional life that you are, in the taxonomy of your kind, bound to her in a way that has no human equivalent, and that you have been managing this fact by turning it into legal scholarship? He seemed genuinely uncertain about the answer. The letters circled the question, approached it from different angles, retreated, approached again. He wrote, in one letter, "I think she knows. I think she has always known and chosen not to know. And I think that is her right. And I think I have to respect it. And I think respecting it might be the hardest thing I have ever done. And I think it might also be the most important." She was crying by the time she finished the 4th letter, without having made any decision to do so, the way weather happens. She was not a woman who cried easily or often, and she found the experience deeply inconvenient, and also, somewhere beneath the inconvenience, necessary in a way she had no language for yet. She sat on the floor of the vault for a long time. When she came out, the hallway was empty. She could hear voices from somewhere deeper in the house, low and indistinct. She walked to the study because it was where she always went when she needed to think, and because it was the room where she had spent more time with Callum than anywhere else, and because grief, she was discovering, had a geography. She stood at the window that faced the back garden. The oaks were in full color, and the light was the low gold of late afternoon, and she stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, and let herself be completely in the fact of his absence for the first time since he died, not holding it at a professional distance, not processing it from behind the glass of usefulness, just present with it. She heard the door. She didn't turn around, because she knew from the particular quality of the footstep that it was Soren, not Rhys, and she was not ready for Rhys's careful management of the situation. Soren came to stand a few feet away from her, not crowding, but close enough that she was aware of him, and looked out the same window. He used to stand there, Soren said. Same window, when he was thinking through something difficult. She let that sit between them. "How much of it did you know?" she asked finally. "None of it." His voice was level, but not without feeling. "I knew he'd bonded with someone. I could tell that much from the few times we spoke. And we barely spoke. I didn't know it was a human. I didn't know it was you." He paused. "I'm not sure knowing would have changed anything. We weren't, at the end, in the kind of relationship where we told each other things." "What happened between you?" She asked it quietly, not as a demand. A long silence. Outside, 2 of the estate's wolves came around the corner of the garden, moving through the fallen leaves, magnificent and easy in their bodies, paying no attention to the house. She watched them absently. "I left," Soren said, not gracefully. "There was a woman involved. Her name was Petra. She was in a bonding arrangement with Callum that the council had approved, a political bond, the kind the old families still did then. She was from the Eastern Harrow territory." He stopped for a moment. "I didn't intend to fall for her. She didn't intend to fall for me. Those things don't ask permission." Mara was very still. "Callum released the arrangement," Soren said. "It wasn't the bond, not the real bond, just the political agreement. And he released it because he was," the word caught slightly, "the kind of man who would do that, who would make the harder choice. But the pack politics were terrible. It looked like a betrayal. Me and Petra, the council thought he'd been publicly humiliated, and Callum handled it by handling it, keeping everyone contained, managing everyone's reaction, protecting both of us really, at some cost to himself." Another pause. "I left because staying was hurting him, because every time the council looked at him, they saw a man whose second had run off with his intended, and every time I was in a room with him, that was the story." "Did he ask you to leave?" "No." Quiet and final. "He would never have asked me to leave." She understood something about Callum that she had already known, but that settled into a different place in her understanding now. He would never have asked. He would have made the space. He would have created the conditions in which leaving was the natural and easier thing, and he would have called that love, and he would have been right, and it would have cost him. "Where is Petra now?" she asked. "She died, 6 years ago. A boundary dispute in the Harrow Ridge territory, pack politics, a confrontation that went wrong. His voice did not break, but it carried the particular weight of a grief that had been lived with long enough to be carried without collapsing under it. Callum sent a letter when it happened. It was a very Callum letter. It said everything that needed to be said, and nothing excessive. She looked at him then. He was looking out the window, his profile clean and set, and she thought about what it meant to be the kind of people, human or shifter, who were loved by Callum Voss. The specific experience of being on the receiving end of that precision, that care, that comprehensive attention to what you needed. He left you things in the vault, she said. I know, the solicitor told me. He finally looked at her. He left me a letter too. Different box. I haven't opened it yet. A slight pause. I wasn't sure I was ready. Neither was I, she said. I'm still not sure I was ready. Something in his expression shifted, opened slightly, the way faces do when they recognize something true in another person. What did he say? That he should have said it while he could. She looked back out the window. That's the first page. The rest is approximately 4 years of legal scholarship and 20 or so pages of working through his feelings in writing. That sounds exactly like him. It does, she agreed. And despite everything, or maybe because of everything, she almost smiled. It sounds exactly like him. They stood in silence for a while, which was more comfortable than it should have been, given that they had met 2 hours ago. What happens now? Soren asked. With the pack, with all of it. Rhys takes formal leadership. The succession documents are ready. I've been working on them. She heard herself say it, and heard the professional crispness in her voice, the automatic armor of competence. The compact's legal standing is secure. The transition should be clean. That's not what I meant. She looked at him again. He had turned fully toward her now, and his face was open, direct in the way she had noticed when she first came in, the quality of someone who had spent enough time outside of Ash Creek's particular social architecture to have shed its habits of indirection. What did you mean? She asked. What happens to you? He said it simply. He spent 4 years building a legal argument for something that can't be implemented now. He left you a vault full of things he should have said, and now you're standing in his study, 7 years deep in a life that was shaped around him, and the pack is going to transition to Rhys's leadership, and your contract will be renegotiated, or not renegotiated, and, he stopped. That's what I meant. What happens to Mara Caldwell? She did not have an answer for this. She had not had an answer for this for 29 days, and she had been successfully not looking directly at the question by being professionally useful, and now she was standing in Callum's study on the 29th day after his death, and someone who had known him in a completely different way than she had was asking her the question out loud, and she had nothing to give it. I don't know, she said. He nodded, not with satisfaction, but with the recognition of someone who had also spent time in the territory of not knowing. Rhys found them eventually. He came to the study door with the carefully maintained expression of a man who was doing an enormous amount of work and was going to continue doing it, regardless of how he felt about any of it. He looked at them standing together at the window, and something moved very briefly across his face before it was managed back down. The council wants to meet tomorrow, he said to Mara, regarding the vault contents and their implications for the succession documentation. I'll be there. There's also, he stopped, then resumed. There's a question the council is going to raise. I want you to hear it from me first. He looked at the window rather than at her. Callum's designation document, the one in the vault, if it were to be recognized, it would alter the legal standing of the bond claim as it relates to pack assets and decision-making rights during the transition period. Mara looked at him steadily. What is the council's position? Divided. He said it carefully. Dre supports recognition. 2 others are uncertain. Weston is opposed. Adrian Weston, senior council member, 17 years on the Ash Creek Council, deeply invested in the old formal protocols of the compact. She had worked alongside him for 7 years, and she had always known, in the quiet way that you know things about people in your peripheral vision, that he did not entirely approve of her presence in the pack's business. On what grounds? Soren asked. He had not spoken since Rhys entered, and Rhys looked at him now with an expression that was more complex than simple assessment. Procedural. The document was not presented to the council during Callum's lifetime. It was sealed and withheld. Rhys kept his voice neutral. Weston's position is that a document cannot be activated posthumously when the bond partner was never given the opportunity to accept or decline during the Alpha's lifetime. There was a silence, in which all three of them understood the layers of that argument. He's not entirely wrong, Mara said. Both men looked at her. The argument has procedural merit, she said. Callum didn't present it to me while he was alive. I never had the opportunity to choose. She kept her voice even. Weston could make that case. The question is whether the council would prioritize procedural formality over the Alpha's clear documented intent. Weston would say the Alpha's intent should have been expressed while he was alive to express it, Rhys said. He'd be right about that too, Mara said. She picked up the folded note from her pocket, looked at it for a moment, then put it back. What do you want? Soren asked. The question landed in the room with unexpected directness. She looked at him. That's a complicated question. I know. He held her gaze. I'm asking it anyway. She thought about the letters in the vault. She thought about 4 years of legal scholarship and 20 pages of careful feeling. She thought about a blanket folded over her on a study couch, and a man who had spent 7 years being exactly what she needed him to be, in her professional life, while managing, in private, something she had never been given the full picture of, because he believed it was her right not to know until she was ready. I want to understand all of it before I make any decision, she said. The legal implications, the personal implications, all of it. I am not going to be maneuvered by the council's timeline. Rhys nodded. There was something in his expression that might have been respect, might have been relief. I need to go back to the vault, she said. I didn't finish reading everything. She spent 3 more hours in the vault that evening, reading by the light of a standing lamp that Rhys's assistant brought down without being asked, which she appreciated. She read systematically, the way she approached any complex document set, beginning to end, cross-referencing, building the complete picture before she let herself respond to any individual part of it. The legal argument was extraordinary. She read it twice, making notes on a legal pad she also found waiting for her, and by the end of the second reading she was nearly certain it would hold. Not certain of council recognition, that was politics and not law, but legally, structurally, the argument was sound. Callum had built it with the same precision he brought to everything, and she understood for the first time, reading the footnotes, that he had consulted her own published work in constructing some of the human legal elements. He had cited 3 articles she had written, 1 under her own name, and 2 under a pen name she used for academic work, and she sat with that for a moment, the specific intimacy of someone reading your work closely enough to argue from it. There was one more box she had not opened. It was the smallest box, pushed to the back of the shelf, and it had no label other than a single M in Callum's handwriting. She opened it. Inside was a photograph and a small object wrapped in cloth. The photograph was of the 2 of them. She did not know who had taken it or when, but she recognized the setting, the north meadow of the estate during the autumn gather, 3 years ago. She was looking at something off to the left, and Callum was looking at her, and the expression on his face was completely unguarded, in a way she had never seen on him in person, because he had never looked at her when he thought she might be looking back. The object was a compass, old, brass, engraved on the back with a Voss family mark she recognized. She turned it over and found a second engraving, added later, in the same handwriting as the letters. It said, "You were always the direction." She set the compass down on the floor of the vault and pressed both palms flat against the cold stone and breathed with very careful intention until she had herself back. She came upstairs to find the house quieter, Dre gone, Rhys in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, and the expression of a man in the middle of a vigil. Soren was in the study. She could see the light under the door, and she stood in the hallway for a moment before knocking. "Come in." He had Callum's letter in his hand. He had clearly been sitting there for some time. The fire in the study grate burned down to coals. the room grown dimmer and closer. He looked up when she came in. "I read it," he said. She sat in the chair across from him, not the chair she usually used when she was working, but the other one, the one Callum had favored when the work was done and they were just talking. She had avoided sitting in it for 7 years. "And?" she said quietly. "He said." Soren stopped, pressed his fingers briefly against his mouth, then continued. "He said he was sorry, for the whole 15 years, that he had handled my leaving badly, that he had let the formal correctness of it stand in for the conversation we should have had, and that if I was reading this letter, it meant he had run out of time to have that conversation in person." He folded the letter, unfolded it, folded it again. "He said he loved me, that I was his brother, in all the ways that actually mattered, not just the hereditary ones. That Petra deserved to have been loved the way I loved her, and that he was glad, in retrospect, that she had been." He was quiet for a moment. He said he was sorry she was gone, that he had thought about writing that for years, and had never known how. Mara thought about the man who had written her letters about a blanket and a couch. Yes, she thought. That sounds right. "I called him 3 weeks before he died," Soren said. "I don't know why that particular day. Something made me pick up the phone. He answered on the second ring, and he said my name, like he'd been expecting it, and we talked for an hour and a half about nothing particularly important. Football scores, a renovation he was doing on the East Wing, a conversation he'd had with a wolf in his territory, who had turned up with a completely unprecedented concern about the meadow boundary." A pause. "We didn't talk about any of the real things, but it was the best conversation I'd had in 3 years." She found she could picture it exactly. "The seal on the vault," she said. "He must have updated it after that call. The date on one of the documents in my section was 3 weeks ago." Soren looked at her. He put things in order. He knew something was coming. "Shifter alphas often do," he said quietly. "The bond with the territory changes as they age. They feel the land differently. He would have known in some way that." He stopped. "I should have called sooner." "He could have called you," she said, not harshly. "You don't have to carry the whole of that." He looked at her with something startled in his face, and then something that settled. "You're very direct. It saves time. I imagine working with Callum, that was necessary." "Working with Callum required it," she said. "He was thoughtful to the point of paralysis sometimes. Someone had to be willing to say the actual thing." She paused. "Which is, I recognize, somewhat ironic, given the current situation." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was its close neighbor. "He wrote about that. In my letter. He said you were the only person who reliably made him say the thing he was trying not to say." She sat with that for a moment, turning it over. All those evenings in this room, the two of them across the big table from each other, working through problems, and sometimes the problem she was making him address was a legal complexity in the compact, and sometimes, she understood now, the problem was something else entirely, and she had made him address that too, without knowing what she was addressing. "The council meeting is tomorrow," she said. "Will you go?" "I have to. I'm their legal consultant." He looked at her steadily. "You're also the person who's named in the vault. Those two roles are going to be in conflict tomorrow." She knew that. She had been knowing it since she read the first line of the first letter, and she had been putting it at the back of the understanding, not because she couldn't face it, but because she needed to finish reading before she decided anything. She was done reading now. "I know," she said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to present the legal argument Callum built, correctly and completely, regardless of the political outcome." She looked at the coals in the grate. "What happens after that? With the council? With my role here? I don't know yet. But I'm not going to let the argument be misrepresented, because it's inconvenient for Weston's procedural position." Soren was quiet for a moment. "He was right about you," he said. "What do you mean?" "In the letter, he wrote." A pause, and she could see him deciding how much to say. "He wrote that you were the person he would trust most to handle this correctly. More than any council member, more than Reese, more than anyone in the pack. He said you understood both the law and what the law was actually for, which were, in his experience, not always the same understanding, in the same person. He met her eyes. He trusted you with all of this specifically because he knew you would be fair to it, even though fairness to it was not necessarily in your own best interest. She pressed her lips together. He put a tremendous amount on you, Soren said. It was not an accusation, but it was not entirely without complexity. He did, she agreed. How do you feel about that? She thought about it honestly. Angry, she said, and grateful, in proportions I haven't worked out yet. He nodded, like that was the most sensible answer he'd heard all day. She slept in the estate's guest room, not because it was the most practical choice, but because driving 40 minutes in the dark after the evening she'd had seemed unwise. And when she mentioned this to Rhys, he had simply gone to find sheets with the air of someone who had been waiting to be useful. She woke at 3 in the morning, the way she had been waking at 3 in the morning for 29 days, the sleep dropping away from her completely and cleanly like a curtain, and she lay in the dark guest room and listened to the estate breathe around her. She could hear, from somewhere outside, the soft movement of the estate's wolves through the grounds. Not restless, not alarmed, just moving the way they moved when the night was cold and the territory felt settled, and there was nothing to be concerned about. She lay and listened to that sound, which was familiar in the specific way that things become familiar when you have spent years on the edge of a world, present enough to know its textures without being fully inside it. She thought about the compass. You were always the direction. She had been very good, for 7 years, at not letting herself want things from the side of the world she was working in. It was a necessary skill. She was human in a space designed for people who were not, working in a professional role that required her to be trusted by all parties, and wanting things had seemed like a category of risk she couldn't afford. She had gotten very good at the discipline of it, the practiced not wanting, the careful management of the distance between herself and everything she actually felt. And Callum had seen it. She understood now. He had seen it, and he had understood it, as the same thing he was doing, from the other side of the same impossible distance. She was angry about that too, less than she would have expected. Mostly she was something else, something she didn't have a precise word for yet, something in the vicinity of heartbroken, but with a different quality to it, something that had orientation in it, direction, the feeling of a compass needle, finding north in the dark. She stopped, not thinking about it. She thought about it directly, honestly, without the professional glass between herself and the fact. She had loved him. She had been loving him for years, with the disciplined quiet of a feeling that had nowhere to go, and she had told herself, this was manageable, because it was. She had managed it, and now the thing that had seemed impossible had become, in the most painful and backwards way imaginable, visible. He had loved her. The vault was full of evidence of how he had loved her, with his whole lawyer's mind, and all the precision he had for things that mattered to him, and she had not known. She was not going to be gracious about the fact that she had not known. She was going to be angry about it for a while, alongside everything else, because she was entitled to that, and she thought Callum would have agreed with her, because his letters suggested that he had been angry at himself for the same reason, in a very organized and footnoted way. She almost smiled at that, alone in the dark at 3 in the morning. In the morning, the house was full of the smell of coffee from the kitchen, and when she came downstairs, she found Soren at the stove, which was the last thing she had expected. He was making eggs with the focused competence of someone who cooked regularly and took it seriously, and he looked up when she came in and pointed at the coffee pot without saying anything, which she appreciated. She poured coffee. She sat at the kitchen island. He put eggs in front of her. "You cook," she said. "I lived alone for a long time." He sat across from her with his own coffee. "You learn." They ate in the comfortable silence of people who were past performing politeness at each other. It was strange, she thought, how quickly that had happened. 20 hours of acquaintance, and they were eating breakfast in his dead brother's kitchen, like people who had known each other longer. Rhys came in at 7:30, assessed the scene with one of his comprehensive shifter glances, and accepted a cup of coffee from Soren, with only a slight lift of his eyebrow. "The council meeting is at 10, he said to Mara. "At the compact hall." Not here. I know the location, she said. Weston has submitted a written position statement. Reese continued. It arrived this morning. I thought you should know before we go in. What does it say? Essentially what I told you last night. Procedural invalidity. The document was never formally presented. The bond was never accepted. The designation cannot be activated. He looked at his coffee. He also suggests that the appropriate resolution is a clean separation of your consulting contract from the estate proceedings, to avoid conflict of interest. Mara set down her fork. He's trying to remove me from the room before the argument can be made. Yes. He can't do that without a council vote. He knows that. He's making the argument publicly so that the other undecided members feel the pressure of it before the meeting starts. She looked at Reese, who was watching her with the expression of someone who was, she thought, more on her side than he was showing. You disagree with Weston's position. I think, Reese said carefully, that Callum was a meticulous man who built a meticulous argument over 4 years, and that dismissing it on procedural grounds, without a full hearing, is not what the compact was designed to do. That was, from Reese Tanner, practically a declaration. She nodded. Then let's go have the meeting. The compact hall was a long, low building in the middle of the estate grounds, built for gatherings, with a table that could seat 16, and usually sat fewer. This morning it was Mara, Reese, Soren, Councilwoman Dre, Adrian Weston, and 2 council members she knew less well, Farrow and Ibsen, both of whom had the look of people who had spent the morning being talked to by Weston and were not entirely settled by the experience. Weston was a handsome man in his 60s, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had occupied formal authority for long enough that it sat on him like clothing. He looked at Mara when she came in, with an expression that was scrupulously neutral, and therefore carried in it, for anyone who could read it, a specific message about how he regarded the morning. Soren's presence at the table clearly surprised him. He covered it well. Mara put the legal document on the table, the vault copy, and her own legal pad of notes beside it. I want to begin, she said, by clarifying my role at this table today. Councilman Weston has raised a conflict of interest concern. I want to address it directly. She looked at him, and he looked back. The conflict of interest Weston identifies is real. I have a personal stake in the outcome of this discussion. I am not going to pretend otherwise. She paused. I am also the person in this room most qualified to evaluate the legal argument before us, because I am the person whose work it is built on, in part, and because I have read it in full. I'm going to present the argument. The council will then make whatever decision it makes. I accept that arrangement. Weston's expression shifted very slightly. The designation document, she continued, argues for the recognition of a bond claim under PAC law, where one party is a non-shifted human. It cites 4 precedents from other compact territories in the last 30 years. 3 of those precedents were contested and upheld on appeal. 1 was never contested at all. She laid out the precedents clearly, one by one, without editorializing. She presented Callum's argument as a lawyer presenting a case, not as the person the case was about, which was one of the most difficult professional things she had done in a long time. Dre asked 3 careful questions. Farrow asked 1 question that revealed he had actually read the document. Ibsen was quiet. Weston waited until she finished. The procedural question, he said, remains central, regardless of the substantive argument's quality. He addressed the table, not Mara, which was a choice. An argument, however well constructed, cannot be activated posthumously without the consent of both parties, established during the bondholder's lifetime. The vault, Mara said, functions as a conditional instrument. It is opened only on specific conditions, the death of the alpha and the presence of the designated party. It is, in structure, analogous to a testamentary document, activated by the conditions it names. Callum's intent was expressed during his lifetime. The instrument was constructed during his lifetime. The conditions for its activation were set during his lifetime. She kept her voice level. My consent was never sought during his lifetime, which is the actual point of vulnerability in the argument. Weston is correct about that. But the reason my consent was not sought is documented in the vault itself. The Alpha made a decision about timing and method. We may disagree with that decision. It does not render the instrument void. Weston turned to look at her directly then. You are arguing for your own recognition. I am presenting the Alpha's legal argument, she said. The Council will determine recognition. The Council is being asked to recognize a claim that was constructed in secret, over 4 years, by a man who is no longer here to be questioned about it. Yes, she said, it is. And the Council should weigh that, along with everything else. A silence at the table. Soren spoke. He had been quiet for the first hour of the meeting, and several people, she thought, had partially forgotten he was there. I would like to speak to character, he said. Weston looked at him. I knew my brother for 34 years, Soren said. I know him to be a man who did not make decisions carelessly. I know him to be a man who thought about consequences more carefully than anyone I have ever met. If he built this argument and sealed it and left instructions for it to be opened precisely as it was opened, that was not an accidental or casual act. It was a considered one. He met Weston's gaze. Whatever procedural questions exist, the Council should not mistake procedural complexity for evidence of bad faith. There is no bad faith here. There was only a man trying to navigate something unprecedented, as carefully as he knew how. Weston said, with evident precision, the Council's responsibility is to the pack, not to the preferences, however understandable, of the deceased Alpha. And the pack's interest, Dre said, speaking for the first time in 20 minutes, is served by honoring the documented intent of its Alpha and by applying its laws consistently to the claims that come before it. She looked around the table. I move that we vote on formal recognition, with a probationary acknowledgement that the standard consent process was not completed, subject to the designated party's own explicit acceptance. Mara sat very still. Dre looked at her. Ms. Caldwell, does the designated party wish to accept or decline the claim as presented? The room was entirely quiet. She was aware of Reese on her left, carefully not looking at her in a way that meant he was deeply invested in what she was about to say. She was aware of Weston on her right, watching her with the complex attention of a man who was sure he had read the situation correctly. She was aware of Soren, across the table, who was looking at her with an expression that had none of the political calculation of the others, that was just, plainly, a person wondering what another person was going to decide. She thought about the compass in her coat pocket, which she had put there that morning without entirely deciding to. She thought about the note. I should have said this while I could. She thought about 20 pages of careful feeling in a vault she had not known existed. She thought about 7 years. I need to be precise, she said, and several people around the table settled slightly at the word precise, because it was the kind of word that meant she was not going to be irrational, and they were relieved about that. The claim as legally constructed designates me as mate equivalent under PAC law. I am not rejecting the legal framework. I want to be clear about that. The framework is valid. She paused. What I am asking the Council to recognize, she said, is that my acceptance of a bond I was not aware of, expressed over the body of a man who is not here, is not the same thing as a living acceptance. The document is valid, the claim is valid, and I am. She stopped for a moment, found her footing again. I am not prepared to accept or decline a bond with someone I can no longer speak to, in a room full of people making political decisions, on the 29th day after his death. Another silence. What are you prepared to do? Dre asked quietly. She looked at the table surface, at the legal document, at her own handwriting in the margins of her notes. I am prepared to acknowledge the claim's validity, she said, to enter the formal record as the designated party, and to ask for a defined period in which I can make a considered decision about acceptance, outside of this meeting and its pressures. Weston started to speak. Callum gave me 30 days to open the vault, she said, before he could. He understood that some decisions require time. The Council can afford me the same understanding. It was Pharaoh who said, I would support that. Ibsen nodded slowly. Dre looked at Weston, who looked at the table, and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, 90 days. 60, Mara said. A pause. 60, he agreed. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. The formal motions were recorded. Mara gathered her papers and walked out into the cold morning air, with the brisk deliberateness of someone who needed to be alone with a decision they had just partially made. She walked toward the North Meadow because it was where the photograph had been taken, and because she needed to be somewhere that was not a conference table. The meadow in late October was all long grass and autumn color, the edge of the tree line blazing copper in the low light, and she walked to the middle of it and stood there, breathing cold air and looking at nothing in particular. She heard Soren before she saw him, which meant he had approached from upwind deliberately, giving her the warning. She turned. He walked across the meadow toward her with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he stopped about 10 feet away, which felt like the right distance. "You did well," he said. "I stayed within my limitations," she said. "That's what doing well looks like, most of the time." She looked at the tree line. One of the estate's wolves had appeared at the meadow's edge, standing very still, its dark coat a contrast against the copper leaves. It watched them with the particular calm attention of an animal that was not threatened and was not threatening, simply present. "What are you going to do now?" she asked Soren. "Stay? Go back east?" "I don't know," he said. "The estate has to be managed during the transition. Reese is going to need help with things that aren't pack governance. Administrative things. I'm reasonably good at those." A pause. "I also think I'm not ready to leave. I just got here." She understood that. She understood it precisely. "I have to go back to town today," she said. "I have work. The succession documentation isn't fully executed, and there are 3 things that need to be filed by the end of the week." "Of course there are." "It's not avoidance," she said, slightly sharply. "I know," he said, with no sharpness in return. "You're someone who works, because the work matters, not because working lets you avoid things. I could see that about you yesterday." She looked at him. "You make a lot of assessments quickly. I'm my brother's brother," he said simply. "We both read situations fast. The difference is, Callum then spent 4 years before he acted on what he'd read." She felt the thing at the edges of that sentence, and she let it sit there for a moment, not running toward it or away from it. "In 60 days, she said. 60 days, he agreed, not giving it any particular weight, giving it exactly the right weight. She nodded and started back toward the house, and after a moment, she heard him fall into step alongside her, not close, just parallel, 2 people walking in the same direction, across a field in autumn. The drive back to town was easier than the drive out had been, 2 days ago, though she could not have explained exactly why. The hills were the same, the light was the same, the key was still in her pocket. She drove with the windows cracked, letting in the cold air that smelled of fallen leaves and earth, and she thought about Callum, with the kind of honest and open thinking she had not let herself do before. She thought about the way he laughed, which he did rarely, and therefore with full commitment, the way his whole face changed for it. She thought about the night they had argued about a contract clause, for 4 hours, and she had finally been right, and he had conceded it, with the graceful specificity of someone who actually preferred being corrected to being wrong. She thought about the way he drove, slowly and with both hands, the way he carried his coffee, the way his voice changed in register when the conversation shifted from formal to personal, in the evenings when the work was done, and they were just talking. She thought about all the evenings they had just been talking, which she had catalogued in her memory as professional rapport, and which she now understood, looking at them with the information the vault had given her, were something else entirely, something they had been building together, without quite admitting what they were building. She thought about the loss of that, which was different from the loss of him in the abstract, and which required its own separate reckoning. She thought about 60 days. She thought about Soren, standing in the meadow with his hands in his pockets, looking at the tree line. She thought about how grief had a way of making you pay a different kind of attention to the people who had also known the person you lost, because they were carrying part of the same weight. She thought about how that was its own kind of intimacy, unexpected and structural. She was not making any decisions about that. She was noting it, carefully, with the professional part of her mind that was always noting things. She was noting it and setting it aside in the part of her mental filing system that she was calling, for now, 60 days. She got back to her apartment in the early afternoon. The apartment was clean and quiet, and exactly as she had left it, and it was shaped around the life she had built, her books, and her papers, and the good lamp she worked by, and the kitchen she cooked in on Sundays. It was a good life. She had built it with intention, and she looked at it now and thought about how it had been built around the edges of something she had not entirely acknowledged, the way a garden grows around a structure that shapes it without being seen. She sat at her desk and opened her laptop and looked at the succession documents for exactly 3 minutes before closing the laptop again. She took the compass out of her coat pocket and set it on her desk. You were always the direction. She picked up her phone and thought about calling someone, her friend Liz, who knew about the packwork in general terms, and knew that Mara had lost someone she cared about, without knowing quite how much she had cared, or her sister in Portland, who would listen with sympathy, but would not quite understand the specific shape of this grief. She put the phone back down. She picked up a legal pad instead, because she was her mother's daughter and her own self, and she was someone who thought by writing, and she wrote for 40 minutes, not about the legal argument, not about the counsel, but about the things that were actually true. The things she had known and not known, the things the vault had named, the things she was going to have to build a new understanding of, over time, without the person who had been at the center of them. She wrote partway through, I am angry, and I am grateful, and I loved him, and I didn't know I was allowed to love him, and now he's gone, and the vault is a gift, and also, it is evidence of 7 years of a thing I could not see clearly, and I don't know yet whether I am more grateful or more heartbroken about that, and I suspect the answer changes from hour to hour, and will continue to change for a long time. She looked at that for a moment, and then she wrote, that is probably correct. That is probably what the next year looks like, from here. That seems like something I can do. She went for a walk in the early evening, around the neighborhood, and then down to the river path she used in the mornings, and the air was the same cold, and the light was the same amber, and the world continued in its reliable way, which she found, today, actively comforting rather than indifferent. Her phone rang on the way back. She looked at the number, which she didn't recognize, and answered it. Mara, Soren's voice. I got your number from Reese. I hope that's all right. It's fine. She kept walking. What is it? I found something, he said, and his voice had a different quality than it had had all day, something lighter in it. In the East Wing, the renovation he was telling me about on the phone. There's a room. She waited. It's full of books, he said. Specifically, it's full of legal texts and academic papers, and what I can only describe as a very organized personal library of human law scholarship. A pause. Including, I counted, 11 books that have your name on them, either authored or co-authored, with notes in his handwriting in the margins. She stopped walking. He'd been reading your work for years, Soren said, and the lightness in his voice was something she could now identify. It was the specific tenderness of someone talking about a person they had loved and lost, with evidence. Not just the documents you produced for the pack, the academic work, the published work. There are papers here from before you started working with Ash Creek. She stood on the river path with the water moving quietly below her, and the compass in her pocket, and all of October, carrying the smell of change. I thought you should know, he said, because I think. He paused, choosing the words. I think sometimes it helps to understand the full extent of a thing, even when it's difficult, maybe especially then. She pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. Thank you, she said. He was reading your work, Soren said quietly, before he knew you. That's not a legal claim or a political argument. That's just a true thing. She found that she couldn't speak for a moment, and he seemed to understand that, because he was quiet. The river moved below her, and the last of the light was leaving the sky to the west, and she stood in the becoming dark, and felt the full weight of the thing she was carrying, which was enormous, and the full texture of it, which was not only loss, but also something that stood alongside loss, without canceling it. Eventually she said, "Are you going to stay in the East Wing tonight?" "I think so. The room needs cataloging. I'm not sure I want anyone else doing it." "No," she said. "Neither would I." A pause. "Soren. Yes. Thank you. For today, the meeting, and the meadow, and—" She stopped. "For being there." "I needed to be somewhere," he said, and his voice was simple and honest, and held all of its own grief in it, without attempting to set it aside. "I'm glad I was somewhere that turned out to be useful." She walked home through the dark with the compass in her pocket, and the cold air on her face, and the 60 days ahead of her, like a particular kind of open road, full of what she didn't know yet, and what she was going to have to be willing to know. And she thought about the first page of Callum's vault, the single line, the specific weight of what he had been trying to say. "I should have said this while I could." She was going to spend some part of the rest of her life being the person who understood what it cost to not say the thing. She was going to carry that. She was also going to carry the 11 books with his notes in the margins, and the 20 pages of letters, and the photograph of herself not looking and him looking, and the compass, and all the evenings across the big table, and the blanket on the study couch, and the hour-and-a-half phone call about nothing important, and every piece of it was real, and every piece of it was hers now, the loss and the love together, inseparable in the way that the hardest things tend to be. She reached her apartment building and climbed the stairs, and let herself in. She went to the kitchen and made tea with the specific focused attention she gave to small tasks, and she stood at her kitchen window while it steeped and looked out at the street below, where the ordinary evening was happening, people walking dogs, a delivery bicycle threading between cars, 2 women laughing on the corner about something she couldn't hear. She poured the tea. She sat at her kitchen table. She opened her laptop, and she opened the succession documents, and she began to work. She worked for 3 hours. The documentation was complex and nuanced, and she was the only person who could get it exactly right, and she knew that, and she did it well, with everything she had, the way she had always done her work, because the work mattered, and it connected her to something real, and it was, in its way, a form of love. It always had been. She filed 2 of the 3 documents before midnight. The third needed one more review in the morning. She closed the laptop. She picked up the compass. It sat in her palm, the brass cool, and then warming to her body temperature, and the needle swung once and settled, small and precise, pointing north with the quiet certainty of a thing that knows what it's for. She set it on her nightstand and went to sleep. In the morning, she woke clear-headed, which was not what she expected, but was what she had. She made coffee, and read through the 3rd document, and found one thing to correct, and corrected it, and filed it, and then she sat for a moment, in the clean morning light. She picked up her phone and called Soren. He answered on the 2nd ring. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the library. I'm currently surrounded by it," he said. She could hear in his voice that he had been there since early, or possibly all night. "I want to help catalog it," she said. "Not immediately, not today, but—" She looked out her window at the cold, clear morning. "It should be done carefully, by people who understand the work." A pause. "That seems right," he said. "And the vault," she said. "The legal argument. Whatever I decide in 60 days, the argument itself should be formally archived. It's too good to lose. I'll make sure it's preserved," he said. "Thank you." She paused. "How are you this morning?" "Tired," he said. "Glad to be there." A shorter pause. "How are you?" She thought about the compass on her nightstand, and the tea she had made in the dark, and the files she had completed, and the direction that everything was beginning, slowly, and without pretending to be other than what it was. "I'm finding my footing," she said. "That seems like the honest answer. It's the only kind I know how to give." She could hear him smile in the silence before he spoke, the particular quality of a silence that holds warmth in it, and she thought about how grief and time, and the unexpected people you find at the edge of loss, work together in ways you can't predict until you're inside them. I'll be at the estate Thursday, she said. There are estate administration items that need in-person review. I'll be here, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She said goodbye and set the phone down and finished her coffee while the morning light moved across the floor of her apartment in its ordinary way, changing every moment, the same and new, the way time moves when you are present to it and not running from it. She thought, he was reading my work before he knew me. She let that be true for a moment without doing anything with it. Just let it be true, fully and without management, the way you receive a gift that you are going to need time to understand. Then she got up and got dressed and went to work.